Legends have a way of growing in the telling, don't they? A simple story becomes something grander with each retelling, picking up new details, new characters, new meaning along the way. Tonight, we're going to unravel one of the most enduring legends in Western culture, a tale that has captivated audiences for over 1,000 years. We'll separate the threads of history from the fabric of myth, exploring what might be real and what was certainly invented. This is the story of King Arthur, a figure who may have lived, fought and died in the mists of early Britain, only to be reborn countless times in the imagination of storytellers across the centuries. So settle back, close your eyes, and let your mind drift as we journey through the sleepy history of King Arthur, where truth and legend intertwine like morning mist over ancient battlefields. Picture, if you will, the rocky coastline of Cornwall in southwestern England. Here, perched dramatically on a windswept headland, stand the ruins of Tintagel Castle. The waves crash endlessly against the dark cliffs below, just as they have for millennia. According to legend, this is where our story begins, where a child destined for greatness first drew breath in a world teetering between order and chaos. But before we can understand the legend, we must first understand the times that may have given birth to it. Cast your mind back to the late 5th century, around the year 500 of the Common Era. Britain is a land in transition, a place where the old Roman order has crumbled away like autumn leaves. For nearly 4 centuries, Rome had governed this distant province, bringing roads, cities, laws, and a semblance of civilization to what they considered a barbarous island. Now, however, the legions have gone home. The great empire that once stretched from Scotland to the Sahara is struggling to survive, beset by economic troubles and barbarian invasions. In 410, when the Britons pleaded for military assistance, Emperor Honorius essentially told them they were on their own. The message was clear: Rome could no longer protect its distant territories. What followed was a period historians sometimes call the Dark Ages, though perhaps that term is too harsh. It was certainly a time of uncertainty, when the old certainties had vanished and new ones had yet to take their place. Into this vacuum stepped various peoples, each seeking to carve out their own piece of Britain's green and pleasant land. From across the North Sea came waves of Germanic settlers, tribes we now call the Anglo-Saxons. They arrived not as a conquering army, but as families seeking new homes, bringing their own customs, their own gods, their own way of life. Some came as hired soldiers, mercenaries employed by British leaders to fight against other threats. Others simply saw opportunity in the chaos and took it. The native Britons, those who had lived under Roman rule for generations, found themselves caught between worlds. Some had adopted Roman ways so completely that they struggled to imagine life without imperial structure. Others clung to older Celtic traditions that had never truly disappeared, even under Roman rule. Many spoke Latin as easily as their native tongues. They had been citizens of the greatest empire the world had ever known, and now they were left to fend for themselves. It was in this twilight world, between Roman past and uncertain future, that the seeds of the Arthur legend may have been planted. Imagine the challenges facing a British leader of this era. The Roman roads still existed, but who would maintain them? The Roman cities still stood, but their populations were dwindling. Trade networks that had once connected Britain to the Mediterranean were fraying. Local strongmen were establishing their own petty kingdoms, each claiming authority over their particular patch of territory. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that some parts of Britain maintained a surprising level of prosperity during this period. Excavations in places like Tintagel have revealed luxury goods from as far away as the eastern Mediterranean, suggesting that some form of organized trade continued even after the Roman withdrawal. Someone with significant resources and authority was managing these trading relationships, someone powerful enough to command respect and wealthy enough to afford imported wine and olive oil. This is where our search for the historical Arthur must begin, not in the pages of medieval romances, but in the fragmentary records and archaeological remains of post-Roman Britain. If Arthur existed, he would have been a man of his time, facing the very real challenges of holding together a fractured society while defending it against external threats. The earliest possible references to such a figure appear in sources written centuries after the events they claim to describe. In the 9th century, a Welsh monk traditionally known as Nennius compiled a work called the Historia Brittonum, or History of the Britons. In this text, we encounter a British war leader named Arthur, who carried the image of St. Mary on his shield and fought 12 great battles against the Saxon invaders. According to Nennius, this Arthur was not a king, but a war leader who fought alongside the kings of the Britons. The text describes him as bearing the image of the Virgin Mary, either on a cross or on his shield, during a decisive battle at a place called Badon Hill. This battle, we're told, was such a crushing defeat for the Saxons that it secured peace for a generation. The Battle of Badon Hill appears again in another early source, the Annales Cambriae, or Welsh Annals, compiled in the 10th century. This source places the battle between 516 and 518 and confirms Arthur's presence there. More ominously, it also records a battle called Camelot, fought between 537 and 539, in which both Arthur and someone called Medrot were killed. These bare-bones references are tantalizing but frustrating. We're given no details about Arthur's background, no description of his appearance or personality, no insight into his motivations or methods. He appears in these early sources like a ghost, present just long enough to fight a battle or die in combat, before vanishing back into the mists of history. Even more intriguing is a reference that appears in one of the oldest surviving Welsh poems, known as Y Gododin. This poem, which describes a battle fought around the year 600, praises a warrior by saying he was valorous, though he was not Arthur. The implication is clear. By the year 600, Arthur was already such a legendary figure that being compared to him was the highest possible praise for a warrior. But here we encounter the first of many problems in our quest for the historical Arthur. These sources were all written hundreds of years after the events they claim to describe. The Historia Brittonum was composed around 830, more than 3 centuries after Arthur supposedly lived. The Welsh Annals are even later, dating to the 10th century. To put this in perspective, it would be like trying to write an accurate account of the American Revolution using only sources from the 21st century, with no contemporary documents to guide us. Medieval chroniclers, we must remember, had different priorities than modern historians. They were less concerned with factual accuracy than with conveying moral lessons or political messages. They freely mixed legend with history, seeing no contradiction in doing so. A story that taught the right lesson was considered more valuable than one that merely recorded what actually happened. This tendency becomes even more pronounced when we consider the cultural and political contexts in which these early sources were created. Wales in the 9th and 10th centuries was under constant pressure from Anglo-Saxon expansion. Welsh chroniclers had every reason to celebrate stories of British resistance to Saxon conquest, even if those stories were more legend than history. A hero. Saxons in 12 battles service Arthur, who had defeated fed their purposes perfectly, whether he had actually existed or not. The question of Arthur's historicity becomes even more complex when we consider the nature of post-Roman British society. This was not a world of detailed written records and careful documentation. Most people were illiterate, and even among the educated elite, the preservation of written records was haphazard at best. Stories were passed down orally, changing and evolving with each telling. What began as accounts of real events could easily transform into legend over the course of just a few generations. Yet the persistence of Arthur's name across different sources and different centuries suggests that something real may lie behind the legend. The Battle of Baden Hill, in particular, seems to have been a genuine historical event. Multiple sources reference it, and it fits what we know about the pattern of Saxon expansion into Britain. There was indeed a period in the late 5th and early 6th centuries when Saxon advance seems to have been halted, creating a generation of relative peace that allowed British culture to flourish. Whether this crucial victory was won by a leader named Arthur, however, remains an open question. The name itself is intriguing. It's not traditionally British, but appears to derive from the Roman name Artorius. This suggests that if Arthur existed, he may have come from a family that had adopted Roman names and customs during the centuries of imperial rule. Such connections to Roman culture would have been significant in post-Roman Britain, where Latin learning and Roman customs still carried prestige among the educated elite. A British leader with a Romanized name might have been better positioned to unite the fractured kingdoms of Britain, appealing to both those who clung to Roman traditions and those who embraced native Celtic ways. The archaeological record offers some tantalizing clues about the world in which Arthur might have lived. Excavations at sites like Cadbury Castle in Somerset have revealed evidence of a major hill fort that was refortified in the late 5th or early 6th century. The scale of the construction suggests a leader with considerable resources and manpower at his disposal. Imported pottery found at the site indicates long-distance trade connections, something that would have required both wealth and political stability to maintain. Similar evidence has been found at other sites across Western Britain, painting a picture of a society that, while certainly changed from Roman times, was far from the complete collapse that the term Dark Ages might suggest. These fortified sites cluster in areas that remained under British control longest, forming a defensive network that could have been coordinated by a single military commander. The geographic distribution of these sites is particularly interesting. They follow the western edges of Britain, from Cornwall in the south to Cumbria in the north, marking what may have been a frontier between British and Saxon territories. If Arthur existed, his campaigns would likely have focused on holding this line, preventing Saxon expansion into the heartland of British civilization. The weapons and military equipment found at these sites tell their own story. Iron was still being worked, though perhaps not with the sophisticated techniques of Roman times. Swords were prized possessions, often passed down through generations and given names that reflected their legendary status. A warrior's reputation was built on his skill with such weapons, and the greatest praise that could be given was to compare his prowess to that of legendary heroes. In this world of warrior aristocrats and hill-fort kingdoms, a successful military leader could achieve almost mythical status within his own lifetime. Stories of his victories would spread from court to court, growing in the telling. Bards and storytellers would compete to create the most impressive version of his deeds, adding supernatural elements to explain victories that seem too remarkable for mortal achievement. Consider how quickly legends could develop in an oral culture. A successful ambush might become a battle against impossible odds. A strategic retreat could transform into a magical escape. A particularly effective weapon might gain a reputation for supernatural powers. Within a generation, the historical Arthur, if he existed, could have been well on his way to becoming the legendary Arthur we know today. The process was accelerated by the very human need to make sense of traumatic historical events. The collapse of Roman Britain was a catastrophe that shattered the known world for those who lived through it. Cities emptied, trade networks collapsed, and the certainties of imperial life vanished overnight. In such times, people naturally turn to stories that offer hope and meaning. A tale of a great leader who had once held back the tide of chaos would have been exactly what people needed to hear. It wouldn't matter if the details were perfectly accurate. What mattered was the message, that resistance was possible, that British courage could triumph over foreign invasion, that somewhere in the mists of memory lay a golden age that might one day return. The earliest Welsh poetry preserves fragments of this worldview. In these ancient verses, we glimpse a society that remembered better times while struggling with present difficulties. The poets sang of heroes who had fought valiantly against overwhelming odds, of victories won and losses mourned, of a time when the island was united under worthy leaders. These poems, transmitted orally for generations before being written down, formed the raw material from which later chroniclers would craft their histories. By the time Nennius compiled his Historia Brittonum, Arthur had already been transformed from whatever he originally was into something approaching a folk hero. The 12 battles attributed to him read less like historical records than like the achievements of a legendary champion. Yet even in these legendary accounts, we can detect echoes of real military strategy. The battles are fought at defensible positions, often controlling river crossings or mountain passes. They show a pattern consistent with a defensive campaign aimed at containing Saxon expansion rather than driving the invaders out entirely. This suggests a leader who understood his limitations and fought accordingly, using geography and local knowledge to offset numerical disadvantages. The most famous of these battles, Baden Hill, appears to have been particularly significant. Multiple sources reference it, and it seems to have marked a turning point in the Saxon advance. For a generation after Baden, the archaeological record suggests that Saxon expansion westward was indeed halted, allowing British culture in Wales and the southwest to consolidate and flourish. Where exactly Baden Hill was located remains a mystery. Various sites have been proposed, from Bath in Somerset to Badbury Rings in Dorset. The uncertainty reflects the fragmentary nature of our sources, but it also suggests how thoroughly the historical Arthur, if he existed, had been absorbed into legend by the time our earliest accounts were written. The transformation of Arthur from possible historical figure to legendary hero was aided by the peculiar nature of early medieval warfare. Battles were small affairs by modern standards, often involving no more than a few hundred warriors on each side. In such intimate conflicts, individual leadership could make an enormous difference. A charismatic commander who knew how to inspire his men and choose his battles could achieve results that seemed miraculous to those who witnessed them. The warrior culture of post-Roman Britain also emphasized personal relationships between leaders and their followers. Warriors swore oaths of loyalty to their lords, who in return provided them with weapons, horses, and the chance to win glory in battle. A successful leader could attract followers from far and wide, creating a war band that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. Such a leader would have lived in a world where the line between history and myth was already blurred. Celtic culture had always celebrated the supernatural, and Christian beliefs added new layers of meaning to old stories. A victory in battle might be attributed to divine intervention as easily as to superior tactics. A narrow escape could become evidence of magical protection. A successful leader could easily acquire a reputation for powers beyond the merely human. The process of legendization was further accelerated by the collapse of literacy in post-Roman Britain. Without written records to preserve accurate accounts of events, stories were transmitted orally, subject to all the changes and embellishments that oral tradition involves. Each generation of storytellers would add their own touches, adapting the tales to suit their audience's expectations and their own artistic vision. By the time literacy returned to Britain with the spread of Christianity, Arthur had already been transformed from whatever he originally was into a figure of legend. The monks who first wrote down the stories of British resistance were recording not history, but folklore, tales that had been shaped by centuries of retelling into something far removed from their original sources. This process of legendary development helps explain why the earliest written references to Arthur are so tantalizingly brief and vague. By the time chroniclers like Nennius began their work, Arthur had become such a towering figure in oral tradition that his basic story was assumed to be common knowledge. The writers felt no need to explain who he was or provide details about his background, any more than a modern writer would need to explain who George Washington was to an American audience. The silence of these early records speaks volumes about how thoroughly legend had already claimed Arthur by the time anyone thought to write his story down. But silence, as any archaeologist will tell you, can be just as revealing as the loudest proclamation carved in stone. What emerges from this mist of half-remembered tales is not the Arthur of later romance, but something far more intriguing, a glimpse of a world where the boundaries between the possible and the mythical hadn't yet hardened into the skepticism we know today. In the 6th century, the idea that a great leader might possess supernatural aid wasn't questioned but expected. The divine and the mundane walked hand in hand through daily life. Imagine the Britain of Arthur's time, if indeed he lived. The old Roman cities still stood, but their populations had dwindled to shadows of their former selves. Grass grew between the stones of once busy streets. The great basilicas and bathhouses had become shelters for livestock or storage for grain. Yet life continued, adapting to new circumstances with the resilience that has always characterized human communities. In this transformed landscape, power had shifted from urban centers to hilltop fortresses. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of these strongholds scattered across Western Britain, like beacons in the gathering dusk. Each one represented a local leader's attempt to carve out some measure of security in an uncertain world. The strongest of these sites show evidence of extensive rebuilding during Arthur's supposed lifetime, suggesting leaders with both the resources and the authority to command large-scale construction projects. The most impressive of these fortifications required hundreds of workers and tons of stone. The logistics alone suggest a level of organization that contradicts any notion of complete social collapse. Someone was coordinating these efforts, someone with enough influence to convince various communities to contribute their labor to a common defense. Whether that someone was Arthur remains unknowable, but the scale of these projects hints at the kind of leader that legends describe. Trade, too, continued despite the political upheaval. Pottery shards found at British sites reveal connections that stretched across the known world. Wine amphorae from the Eastern Mediterranean, oil jars from North Africa, even spices from distant India found their way to British tables. This wasn't the random distribution of ancient trade routes, but evidence of deliberate, organized commerce. Someone was wealthy enough to afford these luxuries and powerful enough to ensure their safe delivery across dangerous seas and hostile territories. The warriors who defended these communities lived by codes that would have been familiar to their Roman predecessors, though adapted to new circumstances. Honor remained paramount, but it was now measured not by service to an emperor, but by loyalty to a personal lord. The bond between leader and follower was sacred, sealed by oaths that were considered binding beyond death itself. In such a world, exceptional leaders naturally acquired legendary status. A commander who could unite fracked effective defenses and maintainous tribes, organized trade relationships would have seemed almost magical to his contemporaries. His successes would be attributed not merely to skill or luck, but to divine favor, to special weapons blessed by saints, to supernatural allies who aided him in battle. The Welsh poetry of this era, preserved in manuscripts copied centuries later, gives us glimpses of how such figures were remembered. The verses speak of warriors whose swords never failed them, of leaders whose presence on a battlefield guaranteed victory, of heroes whose very names struck fear into their enemies' hearts. These weren't meant as literal descriptions, but as expressions of the profound impact certain individuals had on their communities. Arthur's name appears in these contexts, not as a historical figure, but as a standard of comparison, to say a warrior was brave, but not as brave as Arthur was, to place him in a hierarchy of heroism that everyone understood. Arthur had become, by the time these poems were composed, the measuring stick by which all other warriors were judged. This transformation from man to myth, if indeed Arthur began as a man, would have been accelerated by the very nature of the threats Britain faced. The Saxon advance wasn't a single invasion, but a gradual process spanning decades. Wave after wave of settlers arrived, each group pushing a little further west, establishing new communities, intermarrying with existing populations. The process was so gradual that it might have seemed unstoppable, like a slow tide that would eventually cover everything. Against such a vast historical force, individual resistance might have appeared futile. Yet the archaeological record suggests that for several decades in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, that tide was indeed halted. Something or someone organised an effective defence that bought precious time for British culture to adapt and survive in the western reaches of the island. The memory of that achievement would have been treasured by later generations, embellished and celebrated until the historical reality was transformed into something approaching divine intervention. The Battle of Baden Hill, mentioned in our earliest sources, seems to have been the crucial moment in this defensive campaign. The victory was apparently so complete that it secured peace for an entire generation. In a world where warfare was constant and security always precarious, such an achievement would have seemed miraculous. The leader responsible would have been remembered as more than human, touched by the gods themselves. Yet even miracles in that world required human agents. The Arthur of the earliest sources isn't a wizard or a divinely appointed king, but a war leader, someone who understood the practical necessities of organizing resistance. He carries Christian symbols into battle, suggesting someone who could appeal to the new faith while maintaining the loyalty of warriors still attached to older traditions. He fights alongside other kings rather than ruling over them, indicating a talent for coalition building that was perhaps even more valuable than prowess in combat. This practical Arthur, the one who might actually have existed, would have faced challenges that tested every aspect of his leadership. Keeping rival British kingdoms united against a common threat required diplomatic skills as refined as any military strategy. Managing supply lines for an army constantly on the move demanded organizational abilities that would have impressed a Roman quartermaster. Maintaining morale during what must have seemed like hopeless odds called for inspirational qualities that bordered on the supernatural. Whether Arthur was a real war leader who defended post-Roman Britain, or simply a powerful myth born from collective memory, his legend speaks to something eternal in human nature. The need for heroes who stand against impossible odds, for leaders who unite the fractured pieces of our world. Perhaps that's why his story endures, growing richer with each telling. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember that some legends are too important to be merely true.